All right. So I'm now at this third point in lecture 6. I'll put it up here, putting women away. Okay. As women are pushed not only into the dark of the home, where there is literally no power, that is electricity, because one of the things that's going to happen when people roll into your neighborhood in a bunch of tanks is that the electrical grid is going to go down, and it's not going to come back up because there's nobody out there to fix it. So you're now without power for the duration, which may be years. Which means that no internet either, right? Unless you have a generator, and unless you're very lucky and you have access to a satellite. Okay. But you also don't have access to information or knowledge. And those experiences that you do have are being denied, basically because they're not going to be shared. Maybe one of the fastest ways to assure that Iraq stopped being a threat to any country was just to de-skill women, so that, as Enloe says on page 31, women with professional degrees, lawyers, engineers, biologists, doctors, dentists, were seeking work in the private sector as maids. And this is a brutal reduction. And when Enloe's research, and this is going to connect, I hope, with Marilyn Waring's Counting for Nothing work. That I hope these two things will begin to connect for you, with a great deal of other research from the UN, of which there's a ton, shows that, for instance, during wartime scarcity, this is, I'm quoting from her page 84, within most households, women and girls, mothers and daughters eat less, even relative to their fathers and brothers, declining food consumption. So everybody's getting less, but the women and daughters, so the mothers and daughters, get the least. The girls and women are more likely than boys and men to be the wartime targets of sexual assaults by the men in the multiple rival armed forces. Okay, it isn't that boys and men aren't raped. They are, but the rate is just so much lower. Yeah, okay, we'll talk about that. And then girls in fighting forces, she says, are more likely than boys or men to be used as sex slaves, wives, by older men in those forces. And again, this is page 84. This concept of that people take wives is one of the ways of getting around a military policy of no rape. And then you say, okay, well, we'll get married. And then you, quote unquote, marry the person and use them as much as you wish to, and then discard them and say, oh, well, we got divorced. So sexual slavery is hardly contained to the country that is invaded or occupied. And remember that in Vietnam, fundamentally, everybody, not everybody, many, many, many millions of women who were drawn to Saigon and into South Vietnam were driven into Saigon because they couldn't make a living, because the families could no longer make a living as farmers, because the farms had been burned out or bombed, or it was just too dangerous to farm because of the bombing and because of the general war going on. So that people who had been subsistence farming could no longer live. It's like, well, then where are you going to go? Well, you're going to go to the city. What skills do you have? So what you may have is, as I mentioned at the time, it may be that the only thing you're going to do is send your 18-year-old daughter out to work as a bar girl, quote unquote, which means a prostitute usually. Maybe she'll be able to get away without that. But this was considered to be normal by American forces. I mean, the American forces were rolled into Saigon, and they were like, okay, where are the whorehouses? It's like, oh, that's actually your those are your allies you're talking about, and those are their daughters, or their sisters, or their mothers in some cases. And it did also produce, because the Americans were there for so long, and because at the time birth control was such a hit and miss affair. I mean, it's still hit and miss, but it's much more hit and miss then, mostly because the pill wasn't available in a place like Vietnam. So you're relying on men to use condoms, and and because in a traditional culture like Vietnam, there was no such thing as birth control. I mean, that was like, no, you didn't. The parts of Vietnam that were no longer didn't take part in some Asian religion. were going to be Catholic. So no birth control there if they were Christian. There was usually some form of Catholicism because Vietnam had been the religion that came into Vietnam was usually missionary religion, which is often Catholic, not always, but often. Anyway, so this is sort of like this is the normalized. This is what's normalized, and it's gonna, as I say, it's gonna leave behind, because the mostly we're going to get left behind are hundreds of thousands of orphans who are Vietnamese American, divided basically between Vietnamese, usually Vietnamese mothers and American fathers, and they will be shunned as being not truly Vietnamese and shameful. They will be shunned as being objects of shame because they were the products of shame, products of basically rape, prostitution, and the deflower, not just the deflowering, but the poisoning of Vietnamese purity. So another way that women are, used as essentially as cultural tools, not seen as individuals. This issue of rape warfare is enormous. And the coalition forces fighting in Iraq, the worst jobs were assigned to the TPNs, as they call them, the third-party nationals. And this is a story which we really don't talk about. Talk about the unknown, the unknown unknowns. Actually, these are the unknown knowns, as we know about them, but nobody wants to talk about this. The third-party nationals were signed up by usually big organized, like big companies like Halliburton, which is an oil exploration company like BP, but they also are a major military contractor, and there are hundreds of at the time there were a dozen sort of major military contractors. If you're interested in this, have a look at an excellent documentary called Iraq for Sale, which talks about Titan and Kachi, Blackwater when it was still Blackwater, and Halliburton, and so they're sort of the core military contractors got extremely wealthy during the prosecution of the war. And of course Dick Cheney, who had been Dick Cheney, who had been a vice president, I think, at Halliburton, and then became the vice president of the United States, and then went back. I think he went back to Halliburton. By that time, he was ridiculously expensive. I mean, here's one of these people who just, it's the kind of money that they're worth is incalculable. Well, because he steered all this money right out of the government or right into Halliburton. Anyway, let's say you're Halliburton, and you get a contract for building a base in Iraq for Americans, and then running, say, a cafeteria and movie theaters, which they built. They actually built these malls. Effectively, they built little cities, little towns, I guess they were. And they had like Burger King and Wendy's and McDonald's, and they had car dealerships, and you could go and buy a car. You could actually go and see your car and say, I'm going to buy that. It was used as a way to keep people in, especially, a young man who's 21, who's bored, and you say to him, well, if you re-up for a year, if you join for another year of combat duty, you can go down to the Ford dealership here in the PX at the Post Exchange and pick out your truck. We'll pay for it. And they did. So that stuff was available. Well, who's gonna basically run these places? Who's gonna people these places? Who's gonna run your cafeteria? It's like, well, Americans don't want that job, and anyway, it's dangerous. Like, what if you were killed working for Wendy's? How are you going to explain that back home? So instead of that, and anyway, it's too expensive, you go to the Philippines and you put it in an open call and you say, okay, we need 1,000 workers, and we will pay you blah, and this is more money than they're going to make in the next 5 years. So they're like, okay, we'll take it. And they're like, but you have to give us your passports, and this is a one-way trip. I mean, you're gonna go, you're gonna work, and then we'll bring you back, and that's it. And there's no deal. You won't be able to become an American, and you're not gonna go to America. There's no deals about that. That's not happening. You know, if you thought that this would get you into America, it won't. All we're promising is work. Well, people went, and they have continued to go, usually from countries where the poverty is terrible, and the prospects are bad. And they're like, they look at this and they're like, okay, I'm going to be away from my family. I won't be able to contact them. I won't have the money to make a phone call. I'm going to be treated like shit, basically, because the word comes back. It's like, okay, that's not good. It's not going well. I'm not going to be able to get home. And anyway, getting home would cost so much money. I mean, it would, you know, to fly home from, if you could get a jet out of Iraq or Afghanistan, it cost you $10,000 to get back to the Philippines. Well, who's got $10,000? Americans didn't. They're like, oh, I'll have to wait for the military to take me home. So you're going to be stuck there. And if you couldn't hack it and you committed suicide, well, you know, too bad. So these are the third-party nationals, and these third-party nationals are incredibly important to the execution, basically, of the war. So these, this is the untold story. I just told you a little tiny little summary of it. So KBR, which is Kellogg Brown and Root, which is another one of these bloody military contractors, which rebranded in the middle of the war. Because Kellogg Brown and Root was an old brand, which was known as a business brand, sort of like IBM is known as a business brand. They were like, we better fix that. So they rebranded as KBR, because people were like, KBR, oh, okay. You know, it was like, that's Kellogg Brown and Root. It's like, it is? Who are they? It's like an old accounting firm, you know, an old legal firm. Oh, okay. So KBR and other private contractors, this is Montoya talking, have been importing Filipino and South Asian women to work as laundresses. South Asian, right? So this is usually from India somewhere, but also Pakistan. To work as laundresses, cooks, masseuses on military bases all over Iraq. Some of these women have been illegally trafficked through Kuwait, and the question of whether they are being prostituted has been raised, but not fully answered on 165. The extent of the abuses visited on these foreign workers, particularly the women, will likely be very long in the documenting. I just haven't seen much of it at all. Forget the idea that Americans or Canadians will pay attention. Are you kidding? Most people I say, you know, what about the third-party nationals? Are like, the who now? How many of us know for sure our clothes, for instance, you know, aren't being machined, and you name it. You know, Bangladesh, a country in Africa, some sweatshop that has already suffered some murderous fire that has killed, say, a couple of hundred people this year. The idea that women particularly will care what happens to women sees again our reliance on this cultural expectation that somehow women are these better beings, and also that nurture is somehow essential to women's nature. And it's like no, that's essentialism again. Like the Major, says Montoya, who's so enraged, Eli, some people, some women and men react to oppression by competing rather than joining in solidarity. So a note that Montoya, a Hispanic American writer, Latinx, displays a sort of basic racism when she talks about, she says on page 173, she was attacked by these crazy Iraqi guys coming like an Indian or something. It's like, okay. So this is one of these things I was talking about, checking your privilege. It's like, look, let's be aware that everybody expects everybody else's life is not very important compared to their own, and that that other people's experiences are not really real until you get to know them, and then you start to feel for them. But until that time, we are guarded, and depending on the culture, we may be more or less guarded or more or less open. So just the fact that Montoya is herself has presumably been discriminated against a great deal, if not all, of her life, doesn't stop her from looking at Iraqis as being crazy guys who are coming at her like an Indian or something. And presumably here she does not mean a South Asian, but she means the concept of an Indian that we would see in a Western, which, remember, I was talking about. So Montoya's own concerns about the utterly horrible way that she's been treated by the military, the men in the military, the white men in the military, doesn't extend to Native peoples, and it doesn't also extend to the people around her who are also people of color. So don't assume that being treated badly makes for political awareness. It does not. It makes for more fear and for more terror and for more anxiety. And why not? Why would we somehow assume that if you've been badly treated, that this is going to make you sensitive to the, I don't know, ills of the world? You'll be sensitive, all right. You know, your system has been sensitized to being terrified. But the response may be to tighten up. It typically is. I mean, you know, who of us, you know, when we get frightened, says, "Well, I feel wonderful now." It's like that's not usually what happens. You know, we tighten up, we hide our faces, we you know, we want to get into bed, we want to get under something, we want to wrap ourselves up in blankets and hide in little balls. You know, you want to protect yourself. You're not going to go around making friends of everybody when you're terrified.